Old Darren opened his cobbler shop before the sun had fully risen, sweeping dust from a doorstep that had known 40 years of grateful feet. The village of Ashenvale was quiet that morning, wrapped in mist and the smell of wood smoke curling from chimneys. He had no reason to expect anything unusual, and yet the day had already decided otherwise. The broom moved in the same slow arc it always did, steady and unhurried, the way Darren did most things. He was a man built by decades of patient work, thick fingers, a back that had learned to curve over a bench without complaint, eyes that could find a flaw in stitching the way other men found cracks in old walls. He had opened this shop at the age of 19, inheriting it from a father who had inherited it from his. And in all those years, the morning routine had never changed. Sweep the step, unlock the door, light the lamp on the left side of the bench first, then the right, set the kettle. Begin. Ashenvale woke slowly on mornings like this one. The mist that rolled in from the valley had a way of muffling the village into something resembling peace, softening the edges of rooftops and market stalls until everything looked like a painting left out in the rain. A baker across the square was dragging his shutters open. 2 pigeons argued briefly on a windowsill and then gave up. Somewhere behind the tree line, a cart horse exhaled a long and deeply unimpressed breath at the start of another day. Darren finished sweeping, set the broom inside the door, and stood for a moment on his step with his hands on his hips, looking at nothing in particular. He had lived long enough to stop needing a reason to pause and look at the world. It was a good village. It had been good to him. He asked for nothing more complicated than another ordinary day of honest work. He turned and went inside, and the kettle had barely begun to sing when the morning, without warning, without apology, decided to become something li. A small shadow appeared at the end of the lane, waddling forward with tremendous and slightly ridiculous dignity. It was a dragon hatchling, no taller than a barrel, its emerald scales catching what little light the morning offered. Its boots were destroyed, one sole flapping loose, the other split clean down the middle like a cracked walnut. Darren noticed it first as movement at the far end of the lane, a small, dark shape emerging from the mist, the way things sometimes emerge from mist in old stories, as though the fog had grown tired of keeping it and simply let it go. He watched from behind his window, kettle in hand, head tilted slightly the way it tilted when something didn't yet make sense, but was working toward it. The creature walked with the kind of posture that suggested it had been told, and at some recent and important point in its life, to always carry itself with pride. It was following that instruction to the very best of its ability. Its small chest was forward, its chin was up, its tail swept behind it in what it clearly intended as a dignified arc. The effect was somewhat undermined by the left boot, which had fully divorced itself from the sole and now announced every single step with a loud, flat slap against the cobblestones, a sound that echoed down the quiet lane with cheerful indifference to the hatchling's dignity. The emerald scales were remarkable, even in that pale, watery morning light. They caught what little the sun had managed to offer and threw it back in fragments, so that the hatchling moved through the mist, trailing tiny broken glints of green and gold. It was, Darren thought, the most naturally beautiful thing he had seen in some years, and it was currently destroying what had once been a perfectly serviceable pair of boots with every step it took. He set the kettle down. He watched the hatchling turn toward his shop with the absolute certainty of a creature that had already decided where it was going, and full. The hatchling pushed open the shop door and stepped inside as though it owned the building and everything in it. Darren looked up from his workbench, studied the creature for exactly 2 seconds, and pointed to the low stool beside the counter. He had mended boots for farmers, knights, merchants, and wandering fools. One small dragon was hardly cause for alarm. The door swung open with the particular confidence of someone who has never once considered the possibility of being turned away. The hatchling didn't knock, didn't pause on the threshold, didn't offer any of the hesitation that most creatures show when entering a space that doesn't belong to them. It simply came in, trailing mist from the lane and the persistent slapping of that ruined soul. Now and stood in the middle of the shop floor as though it had always been there, and Darren was the one who had only just arrived. Darren looked up. He took in the emerald scales, the amber eyes, the destroyed boots, and the expression of absolute composure on a face that was doing tremendous work pretending the boots weren't an embarrassment. 2 seconds was all he needed. He had spent 40 years reading people through the things they brought him. The way a man holds a worn-out shoe tells you more about him than most conversations will. And what he read in those 2 seconds was simply a young creature in genuine need of help, dressed in dignity because it had nothing else to wear over its pride. He pointed to the stool without a word. No fuss, no wide eyes, no reaching for anything useful as a weapon, which the hatchling had likely already prepared itself for, given the number of doorways it had probably approached that morning with hope and been met with alarm. The shop smelled of leather and linseed oil, and the particular dusty warmth of a place that had been loved through long use. Tools hung in careful rows. Finished boots sat on the shelf like a small, patient audience. Everything was ordered quick. The hatchling climbed onto the stool and extended both feet with the gravity of someone presenting royal documents for inspection. Darren took the ruined boots in his thick-scarred hands and turned them slowly, clicking his tongue at the damage. Dragon hatchlings ran hot inside, he knew. They cooked leather from within like bread left too long against a hearthstone. The gesture was so formal, it nearly made Darren smile. Both small legs extended outward together, feet offered up with a stillness and deliberateness that suggested the hatchling had rehearsed this moment, or at the very least had decided somewhere on the walkover that it would not fidget, would not appear uncertain, and would conduct this transaction with the full weight of its considerable personal dignity intact. It held the pose without wavering, amber eyes fixed on some middle distance, waiting. Darren accepted the boots the way he accepted all things brought to his bench, without theater, without comment, with only his full and genuine attention. He turned the left one over first. The sole had separated almost entirely along the front seam, hanging by a thin strip of stitching at the heel that would not last another morning. He pressed it gently with his thumb and felt how brittle the leather had become, dried and stiffened from the inside out. The fibers broken down not by rough ground or heavy use, but by something working against them from within. He had read about this once, in an old tradesman's journal passed down through his family. A short entry, barely half a page, it written by some long-dead cobbler who had apparently encountered a similar situation and felt the world deserved to know about it. Dragon hide, the entry noted, was the only material that truly kept pace with a hatchling's internal heat. Everything else was a negotiation with time, and time, in this particular contest, always won. Darren set the left boot down and picked up the right. The split ran from he reached beneath the counter and unrolled his finest brine-soaked leather, the kind cured for a full month over ironwood smoke. He rarely used it, saving it for work that truly demanded it, and he set it on the bench without a word of ceremony. The hatchling watched him with amber eyes wide open, utterly still, as though afraid that any movement might break the spell of being helped. The leather unrolled across the workbench with a sound like a slow exhale, dark and dense, and carrying the faint mineral smell of the brine that had cured it. It was the color of deep earth after rain, supple in the way that only comes from time and patience applied in exactly the right measure. Darren had bought this particular roll 3 years ago from a tanner in the northern provinces, who had spent the better part of his life perfecting the process. And he had been waiting, without quite realizing it, for work worthy of it ever since. He smoothed it flat with both palms, feeling the grain beneath his fingers, checking its consistency the way a musician might run a hand along an instrument before deciding it was ready to be played. No ceremony, no announcement. He simply looked at what the material asked of him and began to think about how to answer. The hatchling had not moved so much as a scale, and there was something in its stillness that Darren noticed without looking directly at it. The particular quality of absolute attention that very young creatures offer when something important is happening to them and they understand it, even if they couldn't yet find the words to say why. It was the stillness of someone who had perhaps knocked on other doors that morning, or other mornings before this one, and had learned through disappointing experience that good things had a way of evaporating the moment you relaxed into them, so it stayed perfectly still. Amber eyes tracking every movement of Darren's hands, barely breathing, holding itself together with the quiet. Darren worked in his usual silence, hands moving with the slow confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own craft. "Whoever made these knew what they were doing," he said quietly, more to the boots than to the hatchling. "You've just got more fire than the leather bargained for." The hatchling made a sound like a furnace door easing shut, and Darren nodded as though that settled something between them. The silence in the shop was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't ask anything of the people inside it. Darren's tools moved in their familiar rhythm, the soft scrape of the marking blade, the measured press of the awl finding its path through dense leather, the quiet pull of waxed thread drawing two edges into one permanent agreement. He had worked in this silence so long that it had become a kind of language, and his hands spoke it fluently without any involvement from the rest of him. He held one of the ruined boots up toward the lamp after a while, rotating it slowly, reading what remained of its construction the way another man might read a letter. The stitching along the ankle cuff had been done in a cross pattern, tight and even, not a single stitch rushed or careless. The original sole had been double-layered, the inner cut slightly smaller to reduce stress at the edges. Whoever had made them had thought carefully about how they would be worn and by what, and had done everything within the honest limits of ordinary leather to make them last. They had simply been given a task that quietly exceeded those limits from the very first day they were put on. "You've just got more fire than the leather bargained for," Darren said, and meant it without any judgment in either direction, not against the boots for failing, not against the hatchling for burning through them. It was simply the reality of the scenario stated plainly, the way Darren stated most issues. The sound the hatchling made in response was low and resonant, rising briefly. At the eastern edge of the village square, a tall figure stepped silently out from the shadow of the tree line. He wore a traveling cloak the color of cold ash, hood drawn low, boots muddied with obvious and careful intention. King Aldrich of the realm had been riding alone for 3 days, which his advisors would have called madness, and he called necessary. The tree line at the square's eastern edge was old and dense, the kind of tree line that had been there long before the village and intended to remain long after, and it gave up its shadows reluctantly. The figure that emerged from it did so without sound, without hurry, and without any of the self-consciousness that most people carry when stepping into an unfamiliar public space. And he simply appeared at the edge of the square the way a stone appears at the edge of a river, as though he had always been precisely there and the world had simply taken a moment to notice. He was tall in a way that went beyond measurement. It was the kind of tallness that comes not from height alone, but from the particular way a person occupies their own presence, as though they have never in their life been required to make themselves smaller for anyone else's comfort. The ash-colored cloak was plain to the point of deliberateness, every detail of it chosen to discourage a second look. The hood sat at an angle that suggested shadow without demanding it. The boots, good boots, exceptional boots beneath their careful coating of road mud, carried him across the cobblestones without a sound. King Aldrich had learned many things in 20 years of ruling a realm. He had learned the weight of decisions made in candle-lit rooms that were felt by people who would never know his name. He had learned that power, left unexamined, had a way of slowly replacing the man who held it with something harder and less useful. And he had learned, through stubborn and repeated personal experiment, that the only remedy he had ever found for the hatchling was his ward, left in the realm's keeping by treaty with the Mountain Dragon clans, and it had slipped away 2 mornings ago. The palace staff were quietly unraveling with panic, but Aldrich had simply saddled his horse before dawn and gone looking himself. He spotted the small green shape through the cobbler's open doorway and felt relief move through him like the first warmth of a fire catching. The treaty had taken 11 months to negotiate and had nearly collapsed 4 separate times over points of honor so precise and so ancient that Aldrich's most learned advisors had needed to consult texts that predated the realm itself. The Mountain Dragon clans did not offer trust easily or quickly, and they did not extend it to those they considered unworthy of the weight it carried. Now, leaving the hatchling in the realm's keeping was not a gesture, it was a test. Long, quiet, and ongoing. And every day the hatchling spent under Aldrich's roof was another day the clans were watching to see what kind of man he truly was when something precious and irreplaceable had been placed in his hands. 2 mornings ago, the hatchling had simply gone. A groundskeeper had noticed the small set of tracks leading toward the eastern garden wall just after sunrise, and from there the trail had gone cold in the way that trails go cold when the creature making them is small, determined, and entirely unbothered by the concept of being followed. The palace had responded the way palaces respond to crises, with escalating layers of hushed, urgent conversation, and the particular brand of controlled panic that skilled staff wear like a second uniform. Nobody had raised their voice. Everything was deeply, exquisitely wrong. Aldrich had listened to the first report, asked 2 questions, received 2 unsatisfying answers, and gone to saddle his own horse before anyone could organize a search party large enough to turn a missing hatchling into a diplomatic incident. He stepped toward the shop, then stopped just short of the door when the old man's voice reached him through the morning air. Darren was speaking to the hatchling the way very few people spoke to anything they considered small or beneath their concern, which was to say, not that way at all. Aldrich leaned against the outer wall, folded his arms, and without fully deciding to, he stayed and he listened. He had taken perhaps 4 steps toward the doorway when the voice stopped him, not through any particular volume or urgency. Darren's voice carried none of either, but through something quieter and more difficult to name. It was the tone of it, the complete and unperformed evenness of it, moving through the morning air with the same unhurried weight as the wood smoke from the chimneys above, as though the old man had never in his life felt the need to adjust his manner of speaking based on who or what was receiving it. Aldrich had sat in throne rooms and council chambers for 2 decades. He had heard men speak to kings and to servants, to rivals and to allies, to those they feared and those they dismissed, and he had become, through long and involuntary study, fluent in every subtle variation of human voice that power and its absence produced in people. The slight elevation of pitch when addressing someone important. The flattening of tone when addressing someone who wasn't. The 1,000 small, unconscious adjustments that people made without ever knowing they made them, recalibrating constantly to the invisible social weight of whoever stood before them. Darren's voice contained none of it, not a trace. He was speaking to a dragon hatchling, a small, wordless creature with ruined boots and no obvious social standing, with the same complete and natural respect he might have offered anyone. Not performed respect, not the careful, conscious respect of someone trying to be good, simply the unconsidered respect of someone who had never developed the habit. "There's no shame in burning through good things," Darren said, holding the boot to the light to check a line of stitching. "It just means you've got something inside you worth containing. The trick is finding material strong enough to keep pace with you." The hatchling sat perfectly still on its stool, receiving those words the way parched ground receives rain. He said it the way he said most things, without preamble, without the slight upward lift at the beginning that people use when they want credit for being about to say something meaningful. It arrived simply, attached to the practical business of checking his stitching against the lamplight, as though the wisdom and the craftwork were part of the same unbroken thought, which, for Darren, they genuinely were. When he had learned most of what he knew about life, from leather and thread, and the particular honesty of materials that could not pretend to be more than they were. Outside against the wall, Aldrich did not move. He had stopped tracking the sounds of the square entirely, the cartwheels, the distant voices, the blacksmith's rhythm, and had given the whole of his attention to the cobbler's unhurried words without quite meaning to. He had employed philosophers. He had consulted scholars whose entire lives were dedicated to the architecture of wisdom, men who wrote in careful sentences and charged considerably for the privilege. None of them had ever said anything that landed with quite the quiet, undecorated weight of what an old cobbler had just told a small dragon while holding a boot up to a lamp. Inside the shop, the hatchling received those words in total stillness. Its amber eyes had not moved from Darren's face. Its small, clawed hands rested folded in its lap. It was not the stillness of indifference or patience. It was the stillness of something opening, carefully and privately, in the way that very young creatures open when they are told for the first time that what burns inside the... Darren finished both boots by mid-morning, resoled and reinforced with brine leather, copper-lined at the toe to carry heat evenly. He helped the hatchling pull them on and watched it stand, test its weight, and take 3 careful steps across the worn wooden floor. The boots held firm and quiet, and the hatchling looked down at its own feet with an expression of joy so pure it was almost painful to witness. The copper lining had been Darren's own addition, unasked for and unbilled, born from the same practical instinct that had guided 40 years of good work. Thin sheets of it, fitted carefully inside the toe of each boot, beaten flat and smooth against a curved form until they followed the interior shape without a single ridge or edge to cause discomfort. Copper drew heat evenly across its surface rather than allowing it to concentrate in one place and cook through. A simple principle, soundly applied, the kind of solution that looked obvious only after someone had already thought of it. He had worked through the last of it without rushing, the shop warming gradually around him as the morning advanced, the lamplight softening into the broader light of day coming through the windows. The hatchling had remained on its stool for most of it, occasionally peering at the work with an expression of intense and barely contained curiosity, but never once reaching out to touch or interfering in any way. It had, Darren thought, remarkably good instincts about when to let a craftsman work. He set both boots on the floor before the stool and helped ease them on, guiding the hatchling's small clawed feet through the openings with the same careful hands he used for everything. The brine leather, dense and dark, held its shape perfectly around the foot. The new soles met the wooden floor with a sound that was barely a sound at all. A whisper where before there had been a slap. A quiet confidence where before there had been damage, announcing itself with every star. "How much?" the hatchling asked, its voice like small stones rolling inside a tin cup. "3 copper if you have them," Darren said. "Nothing at all if you don't. You look like you've already walked further than you should have." The hatchling reached into a hidden fold between its scales and placed 5 copper coins on the counter with slow, deliberate pride. The question came out carefully, as though the hatchling had been holding it in reserve for some time and wanted to deliver it correctly. The voice was remarkable in its way, rough and small and resonant all at once, carrying the faint suggestion of the heat that produced it, like the sound of something that had learned to speak through the same apparatus it used for fire and had made a reasonable compromise between the two. It asked the question the way someone asks a question when they are prepared for an answer they might not like, but have decided in advance to accept it with composure regardless. Darren named his price the way he named all his prices, by looking at the customer rather than the work. The work on those boots had taken the better part of a morning and the finest leather beneath his counter, and a merchant or a night steward would have been quoted a figure that reflected both without apology. But he looked at the hatchling standing there in its new boots on his worn floor, small and solitary, and possessed of a pride that was clearly working very hard to cover a great deal of uncertainty. And 3 copper was what came out of his mouth, and he meant it entirely. At the addition, "You look like you've already walked further than you should have," was not pity. Darren did not traffic in pity, which has a way of making the receiver feel smaller than before. It was simply an honest observation, offered with the same plainness as everything else he said, and it contained within it a kind of recognition that asked nothing in return. The hatchling's response was not immediate. Aldrich finally stepped into the doorway, not fully inside, just enough to fill the frame the way tall men inevitably do. The hatchling spun around with a startled puff of smoke, then went rigid, recognizing him, weighing relief against the expectation of a scolding. Darren looked at the stranger the way he looked at all strangers, calmly, without judgment, simply waiting to see if something needed mending. He had waited long enough. The coins were on the counter, the boots were on the hatchling's feet, and the morning had given him everything it had apparently come to give. Aldrich pushed off from the wall with the unhurried movement of a man who has made his decision and sees no need to announce it, and he stepped into the doorway and stopped there, one hand resting lightly against the frame, and the ash-colored cloak settling around him like something that had learned the shape of its owner over long acquaintance. He did not fill a doorway the way large men fill doorways, through bulk or deliberate expansion. He filled it the way certain people fill certain spaces, through a quality of presence that had nothing to do with physical dimension and everything to do with the simple accumulated weight of being entirely and completely himself in whatever place he happened to occupy. The hood was still drawn. The mud on his boots was still doing its quiet work. To anyone in that square who had glanced toward the cobbler's shop in that moment, he was simply a tall traveler standing in a doorway, unremarkable in every particular. The hatchling spun with the speed that only genuine surprise produces, and the small puff of smoke that escaped was entirely involuntary, the kind of thing that happens when a young dragon's composure and its internal temperature briefly lose their agreement with each other. Then recognition arrived, moving visibly across the hatchling's face in a wave, and it went completely still in that specific way that young creatures go saint. Aldrich looked at the boots on the hatchling's feet, then back at the old cobbler standing quietly behind his counter. "Good work," he said, and meant it in the way a man means something when he has no reason left to say anything hollow. He reached into his cloak and set a gold sovereign on the counter, not as payment, but as the only language he had for what he'd witnessed. His eyes went to the boots first, naturally and without ceremony, the way eyes go to the thing that matters most in a room once the room has been properly entered. They were remarkable. Even from the doorway he could see the quality of the work, the evenness of the new sole, the careful reinforcement at the ankle, the way the brine leather sat against the hatchling's scales without gap or bunching. It fitted as though it had been made for exactly this creature and no other, which of course it had. He had seen the royal cobblers at work in the palace, skilled men with expensive tools and every material advantage, and he looked at what an old man in a village shop had produced on an ordinary morning and found nothing that required an apology by comparison. Then he looked at Darren, standing behind his counter with his hands resting quietly at his sides, neither pressing forward into the moment nor retreating from it. Just present. Just himself, entirely and without effort, the way Aldrich had heard him be for the past quarter hour through a wall of old stone. "Good work," he said. 2 words. He had access to the full elaborate vocabulary of kingship, proclamations, citations, of formal acknowledgments dressed in the language of courts and rendered permanent in ink on heavy paper. He had none of that with him, and would not have reached for it regardless. 2 words, plainly meant, was what the moment asked for, and Aldrich had learned long ago that the most important things he ever said were the ones he said simply. The sovereign came from an inner pocket of the cloak, and he said it all. Aldrich held the door, and the hatchling walked out into the sunlight with its head high and its boots whispering softly against the cobblestones. Darren pocketed the sovereign without ceremony, pulled a waiting pair of farmer's boots across the bench, and got back to work. He never learned who had stood in his doorway. He had simply done honest work the way he always did, which was precisely why a king had stopped to watch. Aldrich stepped back and held the door open with one hand, and the hatchling walked through it with the full composure of a creature that had conducted its business, settled its accounts, and was now returning to the world on its own terms. Its head was lifted. Its tail moved behind it in that same deliberate arc it had attempted on the way in, and this time nothing undermined it. The boots met the cobblestones without a sound worth mentioning. A soft, clean contact, steady and sure, carrying the hatchling forward into the morning light with a quiet confidence that had not been there when it arrived. Aldrich watched it for a moment from the doorway, then let the door ease shut behind them both, and followed without a word. Inside the shop, the silence returned the way silence returns to places that are comfortable with it, immediately and without fuss. Darren stood behind his counter for a moment, looking at the space where the hatchling had sat, at the 5 copper coins still beside the lamp, at the gold sovereign resting among them like a word spoken in a different language that he understood the feeling of without quite grasping the grammar. He picked up the sovereign, turned it once between his fingers, and then placed it in his apron pocket with the same motion he used for everything else, without theater, without prolonged consideration, without attaching to it more weight than the moment required. Then he pulled the farmer's boots across the bench. They were badly worn at the heel and needed new lacing along the left side.